My name is Nicholas, and on Monday 26th of January in Roscrea Rugby Club, a documentary film entitled 100 Years of Change will be screened as a benefit night for Burney SuperValu staff. 100 Years of Change tells societal changes over a century by the late Mabel Wallace from Shinrone, and she tells societal changes from the communities of Shinrone, Roscrea and Burr, which include farming, travelling by train, travelling by horse and cart, when she bought her first car, butter making, education, and many more. I wanted to organise this event as a way to give back to the community, because any time I did my shopping in Burney SuperValu, I was always made feel welcome by the staff. And in fact, Mrs. Wallace's daughter Kathleen told me that the staff always looked after her mother whenever she did her shopping in there. I was delighted when Robert Dempsey from Roscrea Rugby Club came on board to offer the venue, and also Tom Gallagher from Thurles is providing the screening equipment. All proceeds from the night would be going to Burney SuperValu staff.
Hi, I'm John Kenny. I'm a third cousin of Mabel's, and she's very kindly asked me over to talk to her about her life, and what a life that has been. Born in 1923, 100 years this September. Who would have put all this together?
My mother, John, she had one of the first cameras, I think, and it was called a Brownie 620.
You know, she's seen so many changes, and it's a chat with Mabel, and whatever springs to mind, Mabel is going to talk about.
I really have seen an awful lot of changes, and I think the family have been wanting me to do something about it, and friends.
And look, if you wouldn't mind just starting from the beginning, and literally whatever comes into your head. We'll start with your childhood or your first memories on the farm, hunting, racing. So look, we'll get started.
I was born on the 20th of September 1923, Mabel Elizabeth Kenny to Harry and Winifred Kenny of Prospect, Shinrone. And my early life was spent with my elder brother, Henry, who was just about a year and a half older than I was, and George was very much younger, so Henry and I were sort of quite a pair. And so we did everything together. And my earliest recollections, I suppose, were being dressed up in the morning with a coat and scarf, and we wore brown laced-up boots. Now, there were no rubber boots, so we wore laced-up boots, which were bought in Keel's footwear shop in Burr, and the brand of the boots was called Little Duke, which I remember very well. And we spent all our time out in the yard. We first had to feed the hens and get some eggs, and then we had 2 pet rabbits, which also had to be fed, and but we had to pull some grass for them, so That wasn't such fun on a frosty morning, getting our hands very cold, and we gave them a little bit of oats and they got water. They had a nice big hutch to live in. And then after that, when we'd done the hens and the rabbits, we went to the yard to Jack Mooney, who was probably cleaning out stables, and we assisted with that. We went out to the cattle yard to Joey Phelan, who would be milking the cows. My father wanted help. I helped him and Joey Phelan and my brothers. If there were cattle to be brought in or changed from one place to the other, I was always involved in that. And then I thought I'd like to learn to milk. And so I got Joey Phelan, who did the milking, to teach me how to milk. I'd be about 14 or that age, teenage, 15. Then I'd be sitting, what they call sitting into the cow in the bucket and everything. And then to be coming all right, be milking all right, but then if you wet your hands or wet the teats, it was better. So you put your hand in the bucket and got a little bit of milk and put it on the teats, and away you went then. There were 3 or 4 quite quiet ones, so I could milk those in safety. But if they were tricky, you tied their tail to their leg, and then that they weren't able to kick quite so easily then. But I learned all the knacks of milking. I enjoyed milking, and we used to go in then when we had finished milking and separate and go and feed the calves. Shorthorn cross cows, they were not Friesian because there weren't any Friesian cows at that time. And no pasteurization, and nobody coming to look if you had inspectors for health and safety reasons either. All that was not thought of at that time. And we brought in the milk, and it was separated in the house.
You were talking about, because people would be fascinated about this. You say then this is a separate, you put the milk in, you bring in the milk and you put it into the separator.
Yeah, machine.
Now, how did that work? This is for butter later.
Yeah, no, this was for separating the milk and the cream. It was called a separator, and you put it into, it had a sort of bowl, a large bowl on top, and then you wound a handle, and that separated the milk from the cream.
And the cream would emerge from the top one, and you'd end up with your buttermilk from this one here.
As I said, the surplus milk all went out to feed calves and a pig.
My late father, George, was Mabel's younger brother, and he spent all his life here in Prospect. Off the kitchen is our utility room, which we still refer to as the dairy, and this is where the butter was churned.
One of the men came in and churned the butter with an end-over-end churn. You round a wheel and...
Like a big barrel.
Like a big barrel, yes. Just like a big barrel. We ate a lot of butter. There was ourselves and 2 in the kitchen, 3 in the kitchen, because Jack Mooney got his dinner in the kitchen as well. So we got through quite a bit of butter.
So in the summertime, it would probably take about 15 minutes to make your butter with the warm weather. And in colder weather, in the wintertime, then it would take half an hour to make the same amount of butter, the equivalent amount of butter. So the skim milk was left in the end, and this is an ear valve, and this is the bung from which you could let out the buttermilk after you had made the butter, and sometimes salt was added to give it a flavour.
Farming went on. There was haymaking in the harvest and thrashings, and at Prospect it was only growing a big field of oats. But then when the war came in and there were stipulations, as the time went on, then every farmer had to grow wheat and barley. Some of them did. I remember well the binders, because we didn't have one at home, but you could hire one, and a man came with 2 horses, the binder and the 2 horses. And he cut it with the reapering binder. And that it came out of the reapering binder in sheaves. Well, then you had to take the sheaves off the ground and put them into what we call stooks. They're about 5 to 7 sheaves in a stook, and then they were left there for a week or so, and then you drew them in on dray carts into the haggard, and they were put in ricks, 2 ricks side by side, so that the thrashing machine could go between the 2 ricks of corn that was to be thrashed. And it was a great skill. It had to be the man in charge of that, the machine, the thrashing machine, had to be absolutely level, and it was powered by a tractor with a pulley belt. I mean, at Prospect, well, there were 7 men there anyhow, but we'd have up to, men would be sent from Belfield and Corralante and Cangert and Wingfield and possibly Clydorf and maybe a man from the Ringwoods. So but then you had to repay. You repaid that when they were thrashing. So we loved the harvest. That was great fun, up on a big load of stokes being brought into the haggard.
This reaper binder would be similar to the one used on Mabel Wallace's farm in Shinrone in County Offaly. It travelled in this direction, and this is the cutting bar down here, and these are the arms that would have turned the crop in onto a canvas belt, and this canvas belt would have carried the crop up into the mechanism where it was bound by twine, which was in this box here. This particular reaper binder was assembled by Perry and Sons Rathdowney, and the man in charge or operating the binder would have sat on that yellow seat.
I can well remember going out and watching the reapering binder. And then they began to attach later on tractors, but in 1947, I think, Bakers in Cloughjordan had an agency for the Ferguson tractors, the little grey Ferguson tractor that was the first tractor in most farms, I think. And that made life a lot easier because it did for ploughing, and we had a trailer, and there wasn't so much, you were phasing out the horse-drawn bits of machinery.
Yeah.
But it was only used with a pulley belt to grind corn for the horses and bruise oats for the horses and grind corn for cattle. The thrashing season was quite fun, but the catering was for the women in the kitchen was quite a thing all of a sudden, having to, for perhaps surely 2 days, 20 men to feed in the kitchen, and getting meat and bread and jam and butter and everything. And they had to have tea as well, so they came in later in the afternoon and had tea. And nobody wanted it on a Friday because, you see, that would have to be fish.
My late father George was Mabel's younger brother. I'm sitting here in the kitchen of Prospect, where all the men came in for dinner in the middle of the day.
You might be lucky enough to get a ride in a horse and cart, but the men were very particular. We had to sit down in the cart. They wouldn't allow us to stand up. So that went on, you know. We hardly ever went anywhere because it was our mode of conveyance at that time was a pony and trap. Journeys were limited except to when we got to behave ourselves. We were brought to church, but we weren't brought many places at all. We were always home, but we loved it. We loved it, and there was so much going on that we thought it was great fun.
Mabel, can I just ask you about your education? But was there a national school, or how did it work?
Oh, there was a national school in Shinrone, but we didn't go. I was almost 7, and Henry was 8.5 when our freedom all came to a sudden end, and we had a governess came to Mummy employed a governess to try and teach us, to give us some education. Now she was a nice woman, all right, and she had been a governess to other children as well before she came to us. But it meant that it completely curtailed all our fun and out in the yard and being with the men and riding in horse carts and so on. In the morning we were allowed to go out and feed the hens and look after the rabbits, but then we had to come in and have lessons from then till lunchtime in the schoolroom.
The schoolroom is directly across the hall from the kitchen, where Mabel and her 2 brothers, including my father George, were schooled by a governess.
I couldn't lay my mind to it at all. Couldn't learn anything. Of course, I was very stupid, and she was pretty strict, all right. Parents had lunch with us. Lunch was in the schoolroom. They had parents. They had lunch with us. And then there was afternoon tea at 4 o'clock. But then we had our supper in the schoolroom at 6 o'clock, and we were then packed off to bed. And so you didn't said good night to Mummy and Daddy, but we didn't have the evenings with them. She came everywhere with us. Any visiting there was, afternoon teas here and there, she always came with us. But we were very, I was very shy and gauche, and I think it's from being so strictly brought up in a very sheltered upbringing. It took me years to get to be myself, as I say. But anyhow, I never learnt anything. Even when I went to school, I must have been a nightmare to the teachers because I couldn't catch on. I didn't apply myself, I suppose. I went to school at the French school in Bray, private school. But I wasn't at all unhappy at school. Once I got so settled in, I liked not having any sisters. I liked the company, the other girls, and I made a huge lot of friends. Well, then now I liked the games. We played netball and hockey and lacrosse, and I liked that, and I made a big effort there, and I got on to the second teams to start with, and then got on to advance to the first team, and that really I enjoyed a lot, and that meant when you were on a team, you went to play other schools, and you travelled by train or by bus to go to the school, or they came to us, and that I enjoyed a lot. And I loved girl guides. We had a troupe of girl guides, and that I really enjoyed and liked that, all that. And then when I left French school, I went to Alexandra College to do what they called housecraft. And that was learning how to cook and sew and how to keep house. And then we did sewing, and I was making a slip, and it needed to be pressed. And being taught how to use a Singer sewing machine. So I was sewing away one day, and whatever happened, it got caught in the treadle. I thought, well, now what am I going to do? So I thought I'd wind the handle back and it'll come out again and we'll start again. No, it didn't come out. So I was properly stuck.
How did you socialise?
Yeah, the afternoon tea parties were was the thing then, you know, Sunday afternoon. But they were in the winter time, we sort of from Christmas to Easter, you might say.
Mabel, you often talk about going to the picture house in Roscrea.
We called them pictures, we didn't call them cinema. It wasn't you were going to the cinema, you went to the pictures. And we went to Roscrea for we always seemed to go to Roscrea. This was 40s on.
The cinema was a very important outlet in those days. And for all those teenagers, that's the only entertainment we had. That was before the advent of television.
We had to cycle to the pictures into Roscrea. We used to go with Dan and Eva White-Spanner and Bunty Ringwood and Henry and I.
The cinema was a kind of a long, narrow building. And opposite the cinema there was a row of houses. People lived across the road from the cinema. And Billy Carroll of Roscrea owned the cinema in those days. He was a very nice man. Mrs. Downs had a sweet shop in Rosemary Square in Roscrea, just up at the fountain. She set up a little sweet shop beside the ticket office, just as you entered the cinema. The cinema in those days was in 3 sections. The top section, you paid 2 shillings to go in there. The middle section was 1 and 6pence. And down right up near the screen where all the children went in, that was 6pence down there. That area was known as the pit for some reason. And there was a lot of Western films down in those days. And we kind of thought we knew some of the actors, and the actors we talked about them, we saw them so often. Of course, the best ones were Lauren and Hardy and all those funny ones.
We liked the carry-on ones. And Sidney James and Charlie Chaplin and the 2 Ronnies and anything that was a good laugh. And the Dad's Army and anything that you got a bit of crack out of.
Cinema closed in the mid-60s. And on the site where the cinema is now, there's a house there now on the site where the cinema was, in Rosemount, in Roscrea.
You were talking about going to Germany, and you mentioned to me before about visiting Belsen concentration camp, which is intriguing because it can only be 8 or 9 years after the war. So it was very fresh. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, we were staying at Verdun with my sister-in-law and her husband, and they were keen to take us to see Belsen. Now, Belsen is a concentration camp in Germany, was a concentration camp in Germany, and it was in a great big clearing in one of the enormous woods. So you drive in quite a way off the road into where the camp is, and on the way you can see the railway lines, and the wagons were still on the line, some of them, as we approached Belsen. It's very sad, very emotional, and we walked around, and all the way around there are these enormous big mounds, and just written on each is, "Here lies 10,000 bodies." And then the next one might be not quite so big, and it says 5,000 bodies. And that's just a big area now with all these mounds where all the poor people have been executed or gassed. And then there's a huge big cement wall, and that hasn't very much written on it except that it's Belsen concentration camp and the years. But it's very eerie and very sad, very emotional. And the only live thing we saw, I can remember it now, was a rabbit running round near this big cement erection with the writing on it. The only thing alive we saw was a rabbit. But it was very well worth going to see, and one should see it because it's a good thing to refresh your mind of what the times were and how very sad they were for so many people, especially the Jews.
Yes, they'll say that there's a lack of birds, there's very few birds, that
Yeah.
all their instincts will tell them to stay away or whatever. It's interesting to hear about the rabbits.
Yes.
While we're on the wars, Mabel, can you tell us a little bit about Cecil Kenny, who lost his life in the First World War?
Yeah, well, Cecil Kenny, my uncle, my father's brother, was killed in the war on the 24th of March 1918. So no Kenny had ever been to see his grave. So I thought, well, I must do something about this. So he's buried in a place called Ham, the War Graves Cemetery. And I took a red rose for every member of his family. And now the war graves, I don't know if you've ever been to any of them, but they're the most beautifully kept. And they're so neat and tidy, and all the headstones are exactly the same. And there are flowers, a little place for flowers and growing flowers on each grave. And then there was a place in the cemetery where you could write your name, sign your names in this book.
It was very unfortunate. It was very near the end of the war.
Yes, see, that's what we all said, the 24th of March,
Yeah.
and the war was over on the 11th of November.
Yeah.
It was very sad, and he was manning a field gun, and the gun jammed after a bit, and he was out, very exposed. And he was there for 2 days trying to hold his position, and a sniper got him then. It was very sad.
One of the many horrible stories.
Yes, yeah. My father didn't speak very much about him. Only coming up to that time, he'd say, "Oh yes, this is the day poor Cess got killed," and his parents didn't want him to join up, you know. But see, they all thought it was going to be an adventure. I think, you know. Over by Christmas. Yeah. Yeah, the war in 39, yeah, I think I was coming 15 when the war started. And, well, of course, I was at school for most of it. The cooking was rather basic and held on, you know, there was no flour and sugar and butter and eggs and all those sort of things were rationed.
That was 39 or 40.
Yes,
Yeah.
but then that was the same for everybody.
Yeah.
And so the cooking was fairly basic. You see, butter was rationed, sugar was rationed, tea was rationed, a lot of all things. And then clothes, you had to be coupons. You had to have coupons for buying clothes and coats or trousers or underwear and footwear and headgear. You didn't have any coupons for that. But all other items you had to produce clothes coupons, which came every month. Now I can't remember how many each person was allotted with, but children got them and everything. There was so little entertainment to go to. Style went out the window. You didn't think you were going to have a bit of style. When I was growing up, like the girls today now have lovely clothes, everything has to be fashionable. But not for me. I didn't have any nice clothes, never, because you had to have coupons, and you didn't just go out and buy a new pair of socks. These were all woolen socks. It was the thing was done. Everybody mended their socks, or they mended holes or tears in their coats. And then I also want to just say our shoes and our boots, those laced up boots that I speak about, when they had leather soles, and of course eventually they got holes in them and the heels got worn, and they went to a cobbler. Now the cobbler was Andy Brereton, who lived down near Knockshigowna, and they were sent down there, and my father's boots and shoes would also be resoled and healed. But that all happened as a usual thing in those days. When you just had your boots or your shoes resoled, and until, well, like children, we had to get new ones. But I always can remember when we were buying new shoes, Mummy would make sure that there was lots of, our boots as well, that there was lots of growing room in them. I would be probably up the road on a bicycle being sent on a message somewhere, but I'd very often go into Mrs. Phelan's house. Now, 3 of her boys worked in Prospect, so we knew Mrs. Phelan very well. She was a lovely person. And she was cooking over the big open hearth. And in the morning, she'd be very possibly have a cake of bread in the baker. Now, the baker was quite a large-sized, very heavy, round pot with 3 legs and a lid on it. And the means of cooking was you put your bread in the baker, and then you took some burning hot coals from the open fire of turf, and you put those under the baker, and then you put in your bread, and then you put the lid on, and then you put more hot burning turf, and then it was time to look in at the bread. And she had a long tongs which she put in the top of the lid. There was a thing for holding it, a long tongs, and she lifted the lid with the hot coals on the lid and to inspect the bread. But I thought this was a work of art, as it already was, because you had to be very careful that ashes didn't fall in or a piece of turf on your cake of bread. And I just loved, it fascinated me, and I just loved watching it. I thought it was a great skill. I wished I could do it. 1944, we drove the pony and trap to Punchestown, Mummy and George and myself. And that was an epic journey. We left Prospect on Sunday morning and drove to, I called it Maryborough then because it was Portlaoise, and we stayed in Aird's Hotel the first day, and then we drove on to Rathmore, which is a little village past Punchestown, a two-day meeting, Tuesday and Wednesday. But there was a huge thing looking forward to Punchestown because it was the culmination of all the point-to-point winners and at that time. Trams were wonderful. When I was about 9, my front teeth, mother thought were rather prominent, so I was taken to an orthodontist in Dublin, Mrs. Sterling at 13 Upper Fitzwilliam Street, and that meant I had to have what they at that time called bands on your front teeth to make them go back in again properly, and that meant visiting Dublin every 6 weeks or 2 months. And in the winter we went by train from Rossgrey to Dublin, and at that time there was no refreshments on the train except what they called tea baskets. And when you got to Mount Rath, there were people on the platform calling out, tea baskets, and these were a basket you bought with pot of tea and milk and sugar, and you probably got a scone or a sandwich or a piece of cake. And if you wanted a tea basket, you put down the window of the train, the carriage, the train, and you were handed a tea basket, which you paid for. And then later on, you had it then from Mount Rath to, I'd say Monster Evan, or perhaps Hazelhatch, the next station. And there you opened down the window and you handed the tea basket, which you had finished, out to a person on the platform. And Mummy, she would never buy a tea basket. And other people in the carriage might buy what I was hoping they would. And then I would have them under close scrutiny while they had their tea. But see, as a country child, these were all very exciting, very fascinating things to me.
Yeah. And but I'm a bit fascinated with trams. I never went on the tram.
Didn't you?
So that was you got on the tram and there was a conductor.
Yes,
like a bus conductor.
Yeah, and you got on the tram. I loved the tram because when you got on, you got your ticket, a little small green ticket, which he put in a little machine which he had round his neck, and he punched a hole in that, and that made a lovely sort of quite a loud click. And then when everybody had got on the tram, then he pulled a lever. He was at the back of the tram. It rang quite a loud bell, and that indicated to the driver that to move on to the next stop. But I loved the tram. I loved going on the tram. It was so fascinating and so different, and from being at home. I think it was very much part of my education, I thought, going to Dublin and going on the tram. And then some of the shops, Pim's, I know, in Georgia Street, they had this scheme that you didn't pay at the counter. You paid at the counter, and the girl took it, and she put it into a little round box, and then that was screwed into a line above the counter, and she pulled a lever. Your money was sent along in this box on a line to a centre in the middle of the shop. And if you required change, the girl in the kiosk put it into the little round box and screwed it in and pulled a lever, and it came back to the girl where you were dealing with at the counter.
You tell a great story, Mabel, about getting your breakfast ready for your father before a fair.
George.
And can you remember that story?
I can, yes. Yes. Well, this was during the war, and he rode the bicycle to the various fairs. The Roscrea Fair, he would go the night before in the Pony and Trap and stay the night in Clydduff, because we always had what he called good cattle going to the fair in Roscrea. And then he rode the bicycle then other times to Clough-Jordan Fair and Borrisacane Fair and Borrisacane, and Burr. And so one morning I had to get up and get his breakfast, and light the range at 4 o'clock in the morning, and get hot water in a kettle to try and boil for him to shave and make tea and porridge and all that. I dreaded fair morning. I was always hoping the night before he'd forget, but of course he never did. But anyhow, one morning I had a terrible cold, and I was not feeling at all myself, and up in the dressing gown trying to light the range and get his breakfast. And then after breakfast he opened the 2 kitchen doors and went out to the yard. And a cold breeze coming in, I thought, God, couldn't you think he could have shut the door? Turned round, the next thing he was carrying the bicycle in for me to pump. He wouldn't do anything. He always got everybody to do everything for him. So here he took pity. He couldn't send me out. He didn't have the heart, I think, to send me out in the dressing gown because I really had a very heavy cold. But so he brought the bicycle in. And I had to pump the wheels. If he was going off somewhere in the evening, the carb, he'd be out for the evening and he'd need light coming home on the bicycle. So he had a carbide lamp. And you had to put carbide in that and so much water. And I knew all about carbide lamps. And that had to be serviced before he went cycling in the evening. And you lit the carbide with a match and you had light. But so I was well up in carbide lamps during the war also.
Mabel, in today's age of superhighways, you tell an extraordinary story about men tending the road outside Prospect. Can you fill us in on literally what they did and how they went about it?
Yeah, well, just to enlarge on that, the two councilmen, Danny Mooney and Paddy Drury from from Ballingarry, they had horses and carts. Now they drew loads of stones which would be bigger than your clenched fist, and they just laid them in rather like an open potato pit along the verge of the road, and they probably were sitting on a sack filled with straw and a lump hammer, and then they broke those stones, big stones, into smaller pieces, and came back later again, a couple of weeks later, with their horses and carts, and loaded up these broken stones, and they were what filled the potholes. But sometimes people complain to me about the roads, and I say, well, if you saw the roads in 1929, 25, 29, 30, you'd know what a bad road was with the broken stones filling the potholes. But they were so narrow, you know, if meeting another car, you had to slow down and pass by. And then in 1930, I think we got our first car, and it was a Ford. That was hugely exciting because we could go places, and it had a what they call a running board. That was, you know, while you stepped in, it was quite high, and so you stepped on the running board and then into the car. We thought it was wonderful, the car, because we could, three of us, sit in the back seat. And they were very cold. You had to have a rug on your knees, otherwise it was quite chilly. But there were no indicators if you wanted to turn left or right. If you were turning right, you put out your right, you wound down the window and put out your hand. There were no indicators. And you didn't travel very fast because the roads anyhow were so bad you couldn't. And they did now have a self-starter, but if that didn't work or the battery was low, you had to get a man and put the starting handle in the front and turn the engine.
What happens there, it catches on that, and when you turn the handle, you turn the engine block, and so that gives it the initial momentum to kick it off, and then once that happens, the spark plugs kick in then.
My father couldn't, you know, looking out left and right and anything but on the road, he was a danger. When we had there was quite a turn on the Shinrone Road going over to Clydurf, there at the Ringwoods. It was quite a sharp turn, and he was looking to see what was grazing in the lawn at the Ringwoods, and he never took the turn and just went straight into the ditch, and Mother wasn't a bit pleased with him bringing home the mudguard all damaged in the front of the car.
The
car is originally from Tipperary. It was sold to a collector who held it in Monaghan for about 60 years, and I bought the car in 4 years ago, and would be exactly similar to the car that was first driven by Mabel Wallace's family back in 1930.
Our first car, hugely exciting because we could go places.
So when did you get engaged to Hume, Mabel?
June, Hume and I were engaged. I was 21 and we were married in October the 3rd that year, and that's all 1945. And I can remember for my wedding, I wondered was I going to be able to have a wedding dress, because that was going to take a lot of coupons. But very kindly, Mrs. Landy, who lived at the lodge, she got all the other men and their wives and collected a lot of children's coupons for me, so I was able to have a white wedding dress, but really only for her. I don't think I would. The weddings were pretty tame affairs. Wedding service was at 2:30, then we came back to Prospect for the reception, and that all went fine. But see, the bride left at 6 o'clock. And there were no dances or hoolies or fun. Everybody just dispersed and went home. But the men did wear dinner jackets and the girls wore long dresses, but they were pretty basic otherwise. Everybody had to hire. Anyone who came to the wedding, they weren't called taxis then, they were called hired cars. And petrol, well, no, there was no petrol at all. See, the only people who had a car were a priest or a clergyman or a doctor or a hackney car, a hired car. And see, to go back now, the time of our wedding, you had to get dispensation to go to a Protestant wedding. So the only people, there were a lot of people asked of all religions, but the only people who got went and got dispensation were Dr. Murray and his wife in Rossgrave, because he was a great friend of my father-in-law, Hume's father. He and Mrs. Murray came, and Mrs. Lloyd from Etta, who was married to Colonel Lloyd, the General Lloyd's brother at Gloucester. The Colonel lived at Etta Rectory, and so Mrs. Lloyd and her daughter Pamela came to the wedding, and they were the only people of the Roman Catholic Church who came, and they had to get special dispensation. As I say, we were married in 1945, and Uncle Tom Wallace, they had no children. That was why Hume inherited Ballincourt. And then when Uncle Tom Wallace died in 1941, Nora, Hume was in residence at Ballincourt at that time. Well, she then decided that she'd go and live in Dublin, and she had a beautiful apartment in Pembroke Road there, lovely. We used to go and stay with her, Hume and I. He had a cook and a housemaid, and everything went on just the same as Nora was there. So when we got married, I inherited a cook and a housemaid, two sisters, two wonderful people who were with us for years afterwards.
you come from a dying age, and part of that is the steam train. There's a lot of people today wouldn't be familiar with steam trains, obviously. Now, you had the steam train running from Burr to Roscrea. I think it was probably in the bottom of your farm, if I'm right in saying that.
Yeah, yes, perfectly right, John. Yeah, we loved hearing the train. Every morning, if you were out in the yard, you could hear the train. As it neared Brusna, it usually hooted, I think, if I remember rightly. And of course, they were steam trains. They were the man shoveling coal into the fire all the time. And but that was just the way it worked. There were no diesels, or it was very limited in the speed it could go to, I think. And then during the wartime years, coal wasn't very easy to come by. Well, the trains would have had it, but not all of the time. And they were supplemented, I'm told, by turf. So, it was a slow process, but they got there to their stations and so on. But we enjoyed hearing the old train go every morning.
It was the sound of a steam
Yeah, lovely
train.
sound.
Aren't I right in saying that there was a siding at Sharavogue where Hume would have transported his livestock to the Dublin market, and those are freight trains as well.
Yeah, oh yes, it was used for freight, what they called a goods train.
Yes.
And they were called P-wagons because they were joining onto a passenger train rather than a goods train. In the summer, Hume would be sending cattle every week to the Dublin cattle market, and a lot of cattle went from Belfield, and that's why Dick Wallace got permission from the Great Southern Railway to build a siding at Sharavogue, a lay-by off the main track from Burr going to Roscrea, and they've stopped at the siding in Sharavogue it was Tuesday, because the cattle mart was on Wednesday morning, and they went on to Prussia Street. That was where the cattle market was held, which was very close to the King's Bridge. And many years ago, one time, Hume had sent cattle Hume, my husband, sent cattle on the train from Sharavogue to the cattle market. And he happened to be in Dublin himself, and was walking along Stephen's Green when he saw his own cattle. There were 12 heifers or something going to the very well-known butcher in Chatham Street, F.X. Buckley. I think they still maybe own the shop, but it was just extraordinary to see your cattle being driven along Stephen's Green going to Chatham Street.
Yes. So I loaded the cattle with the Wallace's men who were loading the cattle at Sharavogue. I loaded wagons for 10 years there, I suppose.
We had to drive them down on the road to the siding at Sharavogue, and there the wagons were there, and you loaded the cattle. They fixed up the cattle wagons at Sharavogue, and then they went on and stopped at Brusna station, and that was ready for passengers if anybody wanted to join the train. Yeah.
And when you were a kid, can you tell us about paraffin lamps? You'd no electricity and no oil-fired central heating or whatever. So can you tell us how you heated the place, and how literally did you read by candlelight, or can you talk about that?
It was so cold, a huge big house, no central heating. I thought I'd die of the cold.
Life was so different, Mabel. I mean, you only lit fires to keep warm.
Well, yes, you only had fires, yeah. I was married. We were married 6 years before we got any electricity. We were married in 45, we never had electricity till 50, 51. And then that was followed then some years later by the telephones, and that was wonderful. We could communicate with each other.
Mabel, quite literally, can you explain to us how you make a phone call to the postmistress?
Well, the first phones were just you lifted the handpiece, and you asked, and you rang. That went straight through to the post office, and then you asked the postmistress for the number you required, and she said, I'll ring you back, which meant she had to plug in her end into whatever post office she was trying to get through with the number. And then when she got the number, she rang you back, and you could carry on with your call. But it all took a bit of time, because it had to go through the postmistress, wherever it was going, the call.
One of the jobs of the telephone operator, when they were finished putting a call through, they then had to document that call. Now, these were just outgoing calls. So if somebody from your area was making a call somewhere else, you had to document that. You had to write down exactly where the call was made and for what duration. And it was the duration of the call that actually determined the cost. At the end of every month, all of the tickets, as they were called, were sorted, and they were sent to the regional exchange, where some unfortunate person had to go through them all, tot them up, and that's how your telephone bill was arrived at.
There was one time I was expecting a person from England to come and look at a horse, and he rang up Ballincore, which was Chinrone 7, and the postmistress answered. It was in the evening, and he rang 3 times but got no reply. And then he rang again a 4th time, and the postmistress said, well, you know, I think they're at the Hunt Jumble sale, but they should be back about 10 o'clock. And so he rang about 10 o'clock, and he came over and spent the weekend with us and bought the horse.
They were iconic times with the telephone.
Well, the telephone was a big step forward in so many ways. And that was followed by the television came after that. But that was black and white. And so I think we really, in the beginning, it only came in the evening.
Yes.
Well, Chinrone is situated right in the very heart of Ireland. We're in South County Offaly, on the border with Tipperary. It's a rural parish with lush green pasture land, woodland, bogland. And Chinrone literally means, Cianroin means the seat of the seal.
Well, I have a great affection for St. Mary's Church of Ireland in Chinrone. I was christened there, I was married there, and I have taken part, I think I could safely say, in all the fundraising for the church over the years. A great many years. I did the floral decorations helped with the floral decorations for Christmas and Easter.
And remembering her husband, she donated the organ that we have in Chinrone. That was after a huge amount of research work into what type of organ we might have within the church. She wanted to make sure that it was the very best that could be got for the provision of music for the worship of the church. But I do remember going up their drive as I came to Ballincore. There was a sweeping drive of beautiful daffodils, and of course Mabel was involved with Daffodil Day. Was a very important part of her life. She supplied daffodils for Daffodil Day and worked with that as a charitable organisation.
The children, Julian was born in Dublin at the Hat Street nursing home, and my gynecologist, being the first baby, sent me to Dublin for a whole month, maybe over a month before the baby was due. And I stayed with my brother-in-law, Hume's brother, who was a doctor in Bagot Street, and his wife Sadie, who were very kind. And when you think about it now, and the girls now who have babies and they're in a lot of cases sent home that evening. But I had the baby and my own private nurse, and there I stayed for a fortnight being pampered, a whole 2 weeks in Hat Street. Then came home, and Nurse Rosswell came with me for 6 weeks in Ballincourt to show me how to bath a baby and feed a baby and all to that. And that was in 1947. Julian was born October 47. Now, Edwina was born the 7th of June 1949. And the same process, go to Dublin, spend a month there, and then have the baby, spend 2 weeks in the nursing home with my nurse and Nurse Rosswell, back to Ballincourt with Nurse Rosswell, and her for 6 weeks in Ballincourt. And then when Kathleen was due in 1951, December 1951, I thought of going to Dublin and away from Hume and the children, and I really didn't want to be going to Dublin and whenever the baby was born, I was going to have it in Ballincourt. And we employed a maternity nurse. Kathleen was due on the 11th of December, and she was born on the 23rd of December, 2 days before Christmas.
Oh, hello, Mummy. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Lovely to see you. And just in time for tea.
And good to see you too.
In the summer, Hume was athletic. I mean, he took part in all the sports, you know, and Monkstown Park was where he went to prep school, and then he went to Petora. By that time, he was quite an athlete, and he was a very good rugby player. He was on the first team. And then he went to Trinity to do agricultural science. Then he was selected for the 1936 Berlin Olympic Games. But as the government were in dispute as to whether the teams were representing the 26 counties or the 32 counties. And finally, they couldn't agree, and no Olympic team went to the 36 Berlin Games. It was a huge disappointment to him, naturally. A picture of Dr. Joseph Wallace, who practiced in Rossgrey, Hume's father. And I think his practice started in Rossgrey after he graduated from Trinity College, Dublin. And he, before that, and while he was practicing, he was an international rugby player and played for Wanderers. And he went to South Africa with the Lions team in 1903 with his brother James Wallace, who was also a graduate of Trinity College. And it was rather unusual, apparently, for two brothers at that time to be on such a team. And Hume had an elder brother, Alec Wallace, who was a doctor in Rossgrey.
On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918, the guns fell silent. This was the end of the First World War. Poppies grew in their millions on the battlefield. Armistice Day is commemorated in November every year.
I was selling Remembrance Day poppies all around this, from, if you might say, from Sharavogue to Rossgrey, taking in Brosna and Etta en route. And until recent years I was working collecting money for the British Legion. Hume's sister married to Charlie Jones. He was president of the Royal British Legion.
And she was honoured, wasn't she, recently by the
by the British Legion.
British Legion. They came down on Remembrance Sunday to Shinrone.
They presented me with a lovely, very beautiful brooch acknowledging the up to 40, it was over 40 years when I'd been doing all these things. And we had it in Shinrone, and all the Irish VIPs came to the service in Shinrone, and the British High Commissioner, he came down in all his splendour and uniform and presented me with the brooch and a certificate as well. So that was a big day in Shinrone at this very special service.
Mabel, moving you on, you went on cruises.
Hume wouldn't fly, he didn't like flying. So we went down to Cove, and we went on the SS America, which at that time was reckoned the fastest liner in the world. So we boarded at Cove. Now, it was a big ship, and so the Cove harbour was not big enough for it to come into the harbour. So we were taken out on a tender. It was quite a rough, choppy sort of sea that morning, but we were on the tender, but you had to climb up a rope ladder onto the liner. Well, rope ladders were I hadn't been on a rope ladder before, but we managed to get on board. I'd love to have gone travelling, you see, but poor Hume didn't like it at all. We went for lots of holidays in Ireland and England.
Janet, Mabel was involved in Meals and Wheels, and I know you were involved too.
Yeah, I think she was involved from the very beginning of them. I remember in the Haythorne Thwaites time that Rosemary and she, and I think they practically, the helpers nearly cooked the dinners as well at that time. Yeah. And then it progressed a bit. But she was loyal to that.
I loved doing Meals on Wheels. I did that for 40 years, I suppose, at least, in Burr. When did I start? 58, I think.
I came in to take somebody else's place and went with Mabel. Mabel was always the driver.
And one elderly gentleman had brought, he was keen, he liked horses, and he'd have a bet now and again, and so we always had to have a little bit of a chat. In fact, they all liked a little bit of chat, you see, because a lot of them were living on their own, and just somebody bringing out dinner and a little bit of chat, I think, cheered them up for the day. But this elderly gentleman, one day I was leaving the house and giving him his dinner, and he was thanking me, most appreciative of his dinner, and he went on about how thankful he was at getting it, and he said, "You're a great girl." But I was 90 at the time, so I felt frightfully flattered to be told I was a great girl.
If you could just talk about the presentation to you in January 2019 in South Park, Ballingarry. It was called Mabel's Meet. It was to honour your 90th season as a member of the Ormond Hunt.
Well, the commemoration meet was very exciting and very much appreciated by me, to be acknowledged as a senior and older member of the Ormond Hunt, and I was invited to what was on the hunt card as Mabel's Meet, so that was very exciting. Great number of people turned up, people I hadn't seen for years, and I really thoroughly enjoyed it. And John as chairman, and the huntsmen were there, and the whips were there, all on the doorstep of South Park. And this is the home of the Ormond Hunt secretary, Jessica Cahalan. And it was Jessica who presented me with the lovely picture of the hound, and it is called Treacle. I really appreciated it enormously. I have been hunting since I was the age of 5. We were married for 54 years. Hume died in 2000, January 2000. My marriage was so happily married to Hume. Made my whole life, those 54 years. And we were so happy together. And all the things we did together, and making Ballincore, as we thought, a lovely home for the children and everybody, and all the lovely, wonderful visitors we had, and great times we had. And that I look back as, you know, those were good days. Days long gone by, I know, but they were good days, and we had lovely times with the children and going on holidays and all, and everything, doing all the things together. And even just nearly every Sunday afternoon we'd go walking with the dogs, long walks through the fields and down to the river, and simple things, but we enjoyed all that. And now, you see, I can think back, or I do, present day now. My family, Julian, Edwina and Kathleen, they're all so very good and thoughtful and kind and looking after me, and all the people who look after me and help me and care for me. And so, I mean, I'm so thankful to them. I'm so blessed and thankful to have them. And my grandchildren come so often, whenever they can, to see me. And my great-grandchildren. I have 20 great-grandchildren who I'm very proud of. And I often think, you know, what kind of world are they going to grow up in? I hope that parents will guide and direct them in the right directions. But I've had a wonderful life, I think. And I have so many friends, wonderful friends.
So Mabel, as I've said before 100 times, you're a remarkable woman, and thank you for telling your story with such clarity, and it's just been absolutely marvellous.
You must be quite exhausted by now. Let's all go and have a cup of tea.